Hey guys, it's Aman
and Christina
from Our Rich Journey. So we talk a lot about early retirement, and one of the big things that we are considering is retiring abroad. In fact, in the last 2 months, we've been to Portugal twice just to figure out what it would be like to retire here. And so on today's video, we're going to go through our top 10 things you must do before considering retiring abroad.
Number 1, if you're considering retiring in a foreign location, you want to make sure you use their medical and dental at least once before you retire there.
We cannot stress this enough. I mean, one of the things that attracts a lot of people to retiring abroad is the low cost of living and the low cost of healthcare. But until you've actually used the system, you have no idea what it's really going to be like.
We've used the medical facilities in Japan, in Thailand, in Singapore, and in Spain. And I think all of the places have been fairly different, but it's very important that you get familiar with how the facilities work in the country that you're interested in going to, especially if you have a lot of medical needs. So it may be very different from your home country, and you want to make sure that you're comfortable in receiving a different type of care in a different country.
So one of the biggest issues that you'll find when you go to a doctor abroad is of course language. And it's not necessarily that maybe you don't speak the language, but it's what is lost in translation. And sometimes tradition and culture don't necessarily translate the same way as they do in medicine. Number 2 is try to interact with the local government. And this cannot be understated. So if you've ever gotten a ticket in a foreign country, try to go pay that ticket. Now, I've received parking tickets in Spain, and the process to go pay a parking ticket is not as straightforward as you may think it is. So just dealing with the local government is a real test of how life will be like in that country.
Now, this can be sort of hard because we're not suggesting that you go and try and get a traffic ticket in order to interact with the local government, but there's things you can do like visit the local city office. These things are really important because it shows you it gives you an idea of how the government works. For example, in Spain, they're very super laid back, and sometimes that's good and sometimes it's bad. It's very different than how, for example, the Japanese government is. So it's a very good idea to just get a feel for how the local government works. Number 3 is meet up with local expats in the area. Now, this is really important because they give you a feel. They've lived in the area for a while, and they can give you a feel for how it is to live in the foreign country. And I think the biggest takeaway from expats is not exactly how wonderful it is to live there, but some of the struggles of living in a foreign location. Because I think you have this idea of how things may be, but it's also really important to think of realistically some of the things that might not be so picturesque in a foreign country.
Yeah, and if you're an American, try to meet up with American expats. If you're an Australian, whatever country that you're from, try to meet up with those local expats that came from your same country. Because the same challenges that you'll have with relocating to that country, they've probably gone through those same challenges.
Number 4 is visit your country's embassy in the country that you're interested in retiring in. So for example, for us, we live in Japan, we would visit the US Embassy in Japan.
So most embassies are pretty much the same. The setup is usually the same, but the culture at the embassies varies, I think, significantly. What we're saying is that you want to get to know kind of what the culture is at that particular embassy in that particular country.
I think this is important because if there's some sort of disaster that happens in the country that you plan on retiring in, when you're there, you really want to see how responsive the people at your embassy are.
And number 5 is visit the local schools. So if you're retiring early like us, we have children that will be attending the local schools. And you really want to just kind of check things out to get a feel for what the educational system will be like. Even if you're homeschooling your children, it's still important to visit the local schools in that country because there are some countries that require you, even though you're homeschooling your children, to register with the local school in your neighborhood.
The next thing that you want to think about is whether you can continue doing the hobbies that you really like to do in the foreign country that you're interested in retiring in. So, for example, if you really like brewing beer at home, that might not be an option for you in certain countries.
Yeah, I have a hobby that I have really wanted to pursue for some time, but I haven't been able to do it in Japan. and is I want to restore old airstreams. Now, Japan does have airstreams, but they are very difficult to get a hold of, and they're very expensive to renovate there. So you just kind of have to keep those things in mind in whatever country you're planning to retire to. And number 7 is visit the country every time of the year. And when we say every time of the year, most people, when they fall in love with the country, they fall in love with it during the optimal time of the year, whether it's the summer or maybe it's the winter when you're skiing down the slopes or something like that. But what you want to do is visit your country during every season so that you get a feel for what life is really like year round.
For example, we lived in Spain, and Sevilla, Spain specifically has a very super hot summer.
Oh my goodness.
And you would not realize this. Even if you go to other areas in Spain, you wouldn't realize this. In Sevilla, Spain, it gets unbearably hot. And if you go through each season in Sevilla, you would realize this. But if you didn't and you retired there and you got there over the summer, you might not like it very much.
Oh yeah, you would probably think, what the did I sign up for? So that's just an example, and we can talk about many places that are ideal during a certain season. Another example are the folks that retire in these beach communities, and during the summer the beaches are bustling. They're wonderful places, but if you go during the winter, they're a ghost town. And in fact, there's basically no one around and there's no services. So what you think you may be retiring to is not that year round. Number 8, remove yourself from the tourist scene. So most tourist areas provide the best services. People are usually waiting on you hand and foot. They want you to come back to this particular area because it's a tourist location or it's the tourist part of town. But when you're considering retiring abroad, remove yourself from that part of town. Go to an area where there's not a lot of tourism, where there's not a lot of foreigners, where everyone there is a local.
This brings us to our next tip. You want to stay in a house and not a hotel at least once so you can understand the neighborhood and the housing conditions. Why this is important is because hotels always have the best amenities. The AC is always working, the heater is always working, everything works just fine. But in a house, you might be able to see things that you wouldn't notice in a hotel. I'll give you an example of little quirks that we noticed. So when we lived in Spain, when it rained really hard, sometimes our back area would flood, sometimes the water wouldn't run anymore, and the house a lot of times in the winter would get super cold. Now these are things that in a hotel you wouldn't experience at all, and you might not experience it in every house, but you will see things that are different potentially in a house versus a hotel.
And our last tip is drive a car. Rent a car in that country and drive through the city, drive through the countryside, but get that experience of driving, especially if you plan on driving in that country.
Yes, I mean, I will tell you, in Japan when we're driving, the roads, some of the roads are so narrow, it's difficult to maneuver. And in Europe, a lot of the cars are manual, where it's a stick, and for me, it was very difficult to learn how to drive a stick. So these are some of the things you sort of want to be aware of before you move to that foreign country.
Now, if you're not planning on driving in that country, take the public transportation, but experience all modes of transportation. The subway, the buses, a taxi, a tut-tut, do it all, but really understand how you're going to get around in that country.
So those are our 10 tips for things you should do before you decide to move to a foreign country. If you like this video, make sure you give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and join the journey.